Hey guys, tonight we set sail across a Pacific so wide, your brain can't quite stretch itself far enough to measure it. You're sitting on a slender canoe, the kind built from breadfruit wood and coconut fiber, the hull slick with salt and old stories, the mast creaking like a tired shoulder. Overhead, stars crowd the night like they're waiting for a show. The Milky Way pours itself across the black, a dazzling spill of light so thick you could almost scoop it up with your hands. And you know what? You're about to depend on those same stars, those same waves, to cross an ocean bigger than your imagination. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this if you try it on your own, but you're here tonight to drift into someone else's dangerous expertise, the Polynesian navigators. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love for you to drop a comment with your location and local time, because trust me, those ancient sailors would have wanted to know exactly where you were too. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The canoe rocks gently, the smell of salt and sun-baked rope sticking to your skin. You glance over the side and see the black water ripple with streaks of starlight. There are no buoys, no glowing GPS dots, no lighthouse beacons winking in the distance. The sea is one continuous velvet fabric, stitched only with swells. You've stepped into the Polynesian world, where the ocean isn't an obstacle. It's a road, a map, a living companion. You breathe deep, because the first lesson out here is to relax your eyes and widen your senses. That's what every apprentice navigator was told. When you stare too hard, you miss things. But when you soften your vision, you catch the gentle tilt of the horizon, the way one set of swells moves differently than another. It feels almost like eavesdropping on the ocean whispering. A historical fact rolls in like the tide. Polynesians began spreading across the Pacific around 1200 BCE, reaching Tonga and Samoa, and later voyaging even farther to places like Hawaii, Rapa Nui, and New Zealand. They weren't lost castaways. They were masters of planned expeditions. Historians still argue whether each island was discovered intentionally, or if a few accidental drifts taught sailors what worked and what didn't. Either way, the sheer scope of their journeys dwarfs what Europeans managed centuries later with far more technology. The canoe shifts beneath you. You notice the hull responds not just to the wind, but to something subtler, the heave of the deep swells rolling beneath the chop. Every few seconds, a larger rhythm pushes the boat just slightly higher, like the heartbeat of the ocean itself. Out here, you don't just see the sea, you feel it, every nerve in your body becoming an instrument. Now here's a quirky tidbit. Some old navigators swore that if you put your hand into the water at night and stirred, you could feel tiny vibrations from distant reefs carried by the swells. Almost like the ocean was a giant drumhead, and the islands were tapping out rhythms across its surface. Whether that was poetic exaggeration or genuine sensitivity is still debated. But you try it anyway. Your fingers cut the cool water, and you half imagine you do feel some distant pulse, faint as a memory. Above, the stars seem to rotate slowly, each one dragging an invisible string across the horizon. The navigators called them star lines, and you'll need to memorize where each one rises and sets. Right now, the Southern Cross hangs low, tilting like a compass arrow, while Orion lounges sideways in the northern sky. You realize you're not just floating, you're inside a vast planetarium that never closes. But the stars alone won't keep you alive. You're told again and again, trust the swells. Because even on cloudy nights, when the heavens vanish, the sea keeps its rhythm. You press your palm flat to the deck, feeling the rise and fall. It's hypnotic, like the rocking chair of some enormous grandmother rocking the whole world to sleep. There's a quiet irony here. In the modern world, you rely on satellite signals, glowing maps on your phone, digital voices calmly saying, "Turn left in 200 meters." Out here, there's no such safety net. You only have yourself, your training, and an ocean that couldn't care less if you get where you're going. And yet, somehow, for over 1,000 years, Polynesian sailors managed to stitch a network of journeys across the Pacific so accurate that they populated islands thousands of miles apart. One more debate drifts in with the swells. Did the first wave of migration move deliberately, or was it a process of trial, error, and occasional disaster? Some scholars picture brave expeditions led by master navigators. Others imagine smaller, desperate drifts after storms blew canoes off course. Either way, the skill you're learning tonight is about controlling the unknown, taking chaos, and making it navigable. You lie back against the hull. The canoe creaks like an old bed frame, the wood swelling with seawater, the lashings humming softly with tension. Around you, the sea stretches endless, yet you sense direction hidden in its muscles. Each swell is a thread, each star a pin, and you are sewing your way across the world. The night deepens, and your body begins to adjust. You no longer flinch when the canoe tilts. You start to recognize the difference between a short, choppy wind wave and the long, steady pulse of a swell born from faraway storms. You don't need a professor to explain wave frequency. You feel it in your bones. It's one of those times where science and sensation blur, and the only thing left to do is trust your skin. Tomorrow, the real lessons begin. Tonight, you just float, learning how to be still enough to listen. The Pacific has been talking for millennia, and now you finally lean close enough to hear its first whisper. The night slips into that strange pre-dawn hour when the air feels cooler, almost damp, and your eyes catch the horizon blurring into inkier shades of black. The canoe drifts steady, but you're no longer surprised by its rocking. It's becoming part of your breathing. Each inhale matches the rise of the swell. Each exhale slides down with the fall. You're learning slowly that the Polynesian navigator doesn't just look at the sea. He listens to it like a voice. And the swells? They're the secret language you've got to crack. Imagine the Pacific like a giant sheet of fabric. Every storm across the planet pushes against that cloth, and the ripples travel outward. The waves don't vanish when the storm ends. They keep moving, sometimes for thousands of miles. Out here, you're not just catching today's weather. You're feeling the fingerprints of tempests born weeks ago, beyond horizons you can't even picture. It's like reading history with your feet pressed against the floorboards of a moving house. The seasoned navigator knows that the ocean holds several stories at once. One swell might roll in from the east, another from the south, and yet another creeping faintly from the northwest. The trick is learning which story matters to you. If you're bound for an island chain, you want the swell that consistently points that way, like a sign painted across the water. If you follow the wrong one, well, you're in for a much longer vacation than you planned, and not the kind with poolside service. Mainstream fact check. Swells in the Pacific are so consistent that scientists today can trace them back to specific storm systems, often thousands of kilometers away. Mariners in the 20th century, equipped with modern instruments, were astonished that Polynesian sailors had already mastered the art of reading them centuries before telescopes or charts. Historians still argue whether the Polynesians developed this swell-sensing ability independently or if fragments of knowledge drifted with them from older Austronesian homelands. Either way, what you're feeling beneath your body right now is a technology as sharp as a compass needle. Here's a quirky little detail to tuck into your hammock brain. In some traditions, navigators gave names to different swells, like calling them old friends. One might be the grandmother's arm, steady and long, while another might be the angry child, short and restless. It wasn't just data, it was relationship. That meant the apprentice navigator had to memorize not just where the swell came from, but its entire personality, its mood swings, and its habits at different times of year. Suddenly, you're less a sailor and more like someone managing a rowdy family reunion. You crouch lower in the canoe now, placing your bare hand flat on the deck. The wood vibrates softly, not with one beat, but with layers of rhythm, like three drummers playing in the dark. The apprentice navigator would spend whole nights exactly like this, silent, eyes closed, memorizing how the canoe's bones hummed. The master standing over him might whisper corrections, or he might say nothing at all, letting the sea do the teaching. But swells are tricky liars sometimes. They can hide beneath surface chop, disguised by strong winds or tangled currents. So what's the hack? You lean with your hips, not your eyes. The body picks up signals far better than sight when the horizon is confusing. Picture yourself in a rocking chair. If someone suddenly tilts the floor beneath it, your body knows long before your eyes catch on. That's what the navigator lives for. That first twitch, that subtle tilt that reveals the hidden swell under the noise. A little aside for your sleepy brain. Modern oceanographers have compared this skill to pilots learning to fly by instruments in fog. The human body gets disoriented easily when the horizon is lost, but Polynesian navigators rewired their instincts through training, relying on kinesthetic sense, basically teaching their muscles to think. Some scholars even debate whether centuries of this lifestyle created cultural differences in spatial awareness. Did Polynesian navigators literally evolve sharper senses for direction? The jury's still out, but it's a fascinating possibility. The night around you grows heavier, and you hear only the slap of water against wood, the slow breathing of the wind. You imagine being an apprentice, ordered to stay awake hour after hour, with nothing but the dark ocean and your heartbeat. At some point, swells stop being abstract. They become companions. You know when one is missing, like a friend who didn't show up to dinner. And when two swells cross each other, your canoe begins to bounce in a complex rhythm, like tapping your foot in two different songs at once. That's a crossroads, and it means you're near something important. One story drifts in from legend. There are tales of navigators who could sense land not by sight, not even by smell, but by the way the swell broke against their canoe. When an island interrupts the path of a wave, it sends a faint reflection bouncing back. The navigator could detect that return like the faintest echo in a vast cave. You think about that, detecting a mountain of land still hidden below the horizon, simply because the sea told you. It feels almost supernatural, but remember, the line between magic and skill is often just patience and training. By now, your eyes are heavy, but you don't dare sleep. The canoe is your bed, the swells your lullaby, and every roll of the deck is both comfort and warning. Somewhere ahead is land. Somewhere behind, the storm that birthed these swells still rages unseen. And you, perched between them, are learning the ocean's vocabulary one heartbeat at a time. The stars overhead pale slightly. Dawn is still a rumor, but the eastern horizon hints at gray. You feel the canoe shift again, steady against one swell, then nudged by another. You're beginning to understand. The Pacific is never silent. It's always speaking, if you learn how to listen. The horizon is softening now, washed in the faintest streaks of gray-blue, as if someone smudged chalk across a blackboard sky. You squint into it, still lying low on the canoe, and your body sways with the steady rise and fall of the swells. By now you're beginning to realize something important. The canoe isn't just your vehicle, it's your compass. Its long, narrow body, balanced carefully on the waves, is tuned to exaggerate every subtle motion of the ocean. It's like living inside an instrument, one that responds to the ocean's hidden chords. You can feel this when you shift from bow to stern. At the very front, the canoe cuts through swells with a sharp slap, like scissors slicing cloth. At the back, the movements are slower, more exaggerated, almost like a pendulum swinging. Every part of this vessel has its own language, and the navigator learns to read them all. That's why apprentices spent so much time crawling across the canoe in darkness, training their senses to interpret what each plank, each lash of cord, each ripple under the hull was telling them. The canoe itself is an act of genius. You look down at the joints lashed together with coconut fiber, the beams crisscrossing like ribs, the outrigger steadying the main hull against capsizing. This design isn't just about keeping you afloat. It magnifies the signals of the swells. A modern sailor might depend on a compass needle trembling on its pivot. Here, your needle is the whole canoe. Tilt left, tilt right, rock sharply, or roll slow. The language of direction becomes physical. Mainstream historical fact. Double-hulled canoes used by Polynesian navigators could reach lengths of over 30 meters, capable of carrying dozens of crew members and supplies for weeks at sea. These weren't fragile rafts. They were ocean-going ships crafted from natural materials, strong enough to cross thousands of miles. Historians still argue whether these massive canoes developed independently in Polynesia or drew inspiration from earlier Austronesian designs carried westward from Southeast Asia. What everyone agrees on is that they were the most sophisticated sea vessels in the world before Europeans built their caravels. The quirky tidbit? Some traditions held that the canoe was more than just a tool. It was a relative, a living being with a personality. Certain canoes were said to be temperamental, prone to complaining in storms, while others were calm, reliable companions. Before a voyage, rituals were performed to feed the canoe spiritually, like giving offerings to a god. It's not just poetic talk. When you live weeks on end with a craft that literally decides whether you live or drown, calling it family doesn't feel so strange. You shift on the deck, listening. The canoe is never silent. Every joint creaks, every rope hums. To an untrained ear, it's just noise. But to the navigator, those sounds are data. A tight creak might mean the swell is pressing differently from last night. A slack lash might hint at a subtle shift in the balance. Imagine sleeping next to a partner who mumbles in their dreams. You don't always understand the words, but you know the mood. The canoe talks the same way. Out on the ocean, where stars disappear behind clouds and swells collide into confusing chop, the canoe saves you. You lie belly down, feeling with every inch of skin pressed against the deck. The swells line up the boat, nudging it into harmony with the long pulse rolling from one direction. Your body begins to memorize. When the bow points slightly northwest, the swells hold you steady. When you drift off that line, the rocking feels wrong, unbalanced. You don't need a compass, you are the compass. Historians still argue whether the navigators taught this through strict formulas, angles, chance, precise measurements, or through pure bodily apprenticeship. Was it knowledge you could write down, or only something you could inherit by lying in the canoe, night after night, for years? The truth is probably both. Some knowledge was preserved in chance, long verses memorized by heart, while the fine-tuning could only ever be learned through muscle and bone. The wind picks up now, blowing across your cheeks, carrying that faint smell of salt and something vegetal, maybe a drifting scrap of seaweed far from home. You glance down the outrigger and realize how much balance it provides. Without it, one awkward swell could roll you over. But with it, the canoe sits like a tripod on the sea, stable enough to exaggerate the ocean's most delicate nudges. Modern science would tell you that your body is doing something impressive here. Your inner ear, your balance system, is detecting differences in motion as tiny as a fraction of a degree. Most people ignore those signals in daily life. Navigators train themselves to pay attention, turning instinct into navigational data. You wiggle your toes against the deck, wondering if you could ever reach that level. Probably not, but tonight you pretend. The canoe crests another swell, and you realize you can feel the rhythm without looking. Your eyes could be closed, your ears blocked, and still your body would sense the direction of travel. That's the secret. The canoe teaches you to trust yourself. You stop asking the sea for directions and start letting your body answer. A streak of sunlight finally breaks through the clouds on the horizon, catching the canoe's lashings and making them glow gold. The water sparkles for a moment before calming again, and you exhale slowly. You know now, this isn't just transport. It's an extension of your senses, a bridge between your fragile human body and the infinite, rolling Pacific. You settle deeper into the deck, every bone humming with the language of the swells. The canoe has become your compass, your partner, your patient teacher. And as the day begins, you feel ready to let it guide you farther into the sea's secret grammar. The sun climbs slowly, turning the water from black velvet into brushed steel, then into a rolling plain of turquoise and silver. You stretch your stiff shoulders, the canoe creaking as though it, too, is waking up. Now comes the part where your own body joins the lesson plan. Out here, there are no sextants, no compasses. You are the instrument. Your bare skin, pressed against the wood, becomes the sensor that reads the ocean's signals. You lower yourself flat onto the deck, cheek against the warm planks. At first, it feels silly, almost like you're eavesdropping on a secret you don't really understand. But then slowly the swells speak. The hull rocks with a rhythm deeper than the chop at the surface. It's a slow heave, 1-2-1-2, like a heartbeat under the chaos. That long pulse isn't local. It's the ghost of a storm far away, still marching across the sea. By lying against the canoe, your whole body magnifies those subtle cues. Your ribcage rises when the swell lifts you. Your spine arches when the boat dips. It's a symphony played on your skeleton. Mainstream historical fact. Polynesian navigators often trained by lying in canoes for hours at a time, memorizing how different swells felt in the body. Even modern revivalists confirm that blindfolded apprentices could identify direction just by lying still, their bodies becoming tuning forks for the ocean. Historians still argue whether this sensitivity came from natural aptitude or some simply born navigators, or if anyone could be taught given enough sleepless nights and strict training. The quirky detail? Some oral traditions describe masters pressing their testy apprentices down by the shoulders, forcing them to stay flat against the hull through entire nights. No shifting, no complaints. If they wriggled, the lesson restarted from the beginning. It sounds cruel, but it was deliberate. The body needed to surrender completely, to tune itself into the canoe until the difference between self and vessel blurred. Imagine grounding your child by making them hug the family car until they understood how the engine hummed. It's absurd, but it worked. You close your eyes now, letting your ears drift. The surface wind chops and splashes, but underneath, you feel the steadier, slower motion. The trick is to filter out the noise. The swell doesn't always announce itself boldly. Sometimes it's faint, shy, almost hidden. But your skin knows. The pressure on your back shifts. The muscles of your thighs tug a little differently, and you can tell the swell is sliding in from the northeast. Try this mental exercise. You're blindfolded, your canoe tethered loosely in open water. You lie flat, motionless. After a while, you detect a regular push from your left shoulder down to your hip. That's the swell. You tilt your head and sense it now at a different angle. Your mind builds a compass rose out of sensations, not drawings. With practice, you could point to north, south, east, or west without a single glance at the sky. But the sea isn't kind enough to leave you one clean signal. Swells intersect, overlap, argue with each other. Your body becomes the mediator, sorting the voices. The canoe might rock left, right, left in one rhythm, while the deeper hull rocks forward, backward with another. It's like listening to a jazz band, each instrument weaving its own line, and you must figure out which one leads the song. The ocean loves to jam. One debate that still rocks the scholarly boat. Did navigators consciously think of these swells as geometry, angles and intersections, or purely as sensations? Were they mathematicians with wave equations in their heads, or poets humming along to the sea's rhythms? Some revival navigators today describe the experience as more feeling than thought, but others insist that strict mental charts were memorized. You suspect the truth lived somewhere in between. The sun warms your skin, and you feel the texture of salt crusting on your arms. You shift to your knees and press your bare feet against the deck. Even through your soles, you sense the vibrations. It's as though every nerve in your body becomes an antenna. You imagine ancient navigators training themselves like this until sensitivity sharpened beyond what most people would believe possible. Quirky tidbit number 2. There are stories that master navigators could detect a hidden island not by sight, but by how the reflected swells pressed differently against their skin while lying in the canoe. It's one of those claims modern science hesitates to laugh at, because reflection patterns are real. Whether the human body can truly perceive them at distance is debated, but the fact that the legends exist tells you how much faith was placed in physical sensitivity. As the day stretches on, the swells steady. You practice lying still, shifting slightly, memorizing how each angle feels. You're clumsy compared to the apprentices of old, who spent years repeating this ritual until it became second nature. But for a moment, you catch it, the subtle alignment of swell and hull, the clean line through the noise. You feel direction without needing to look. And then you grin, because you realize the body is the compass. Every inch of your skin, every wobble in your bones, every creak beneath your ribs, it's all pointing somewhere. The canoe and your flesh have fused into one living instrument, humming with the Pacific's eternal tune. The sun is fully awake now, spilling gold across the ocean until the whole surface looks like a sheet of hammered bronze. The canoe glides steady, sails trimmed, and the air around you vibrates with a constant breath, the trade winds. If swells are the ocean's steady voice, then the trade winds are its lungs. They are the invisible forces that Polynesian navigators relied on, sometimes obeyed, sometimes fought against, and sometimes cursed under their breath when the timing went wrong. You feel them on your cheeks first, soft but relentless. These aren't random gusts. They're dependable, so dependable that Europeans centuries later would map their entire colonial empires around them. But long before Europeans drew neat arrows on their charts, Polynesian navigators had already known. These winds blow predictably from the east, steady enough to carry a canoe across half an ocean, if you know how to work with them. Mainstream historical fact: the northeast and southeast trade winds dominate vast belts of the Pacific, blowing consistently year after year. They are part of the Hadley-Cell circulation, born from warm equatorial air rising and descending around subtropical zones. Historians still argue whether Polynesian navigators used the trades primarily for planned two-way voyages, or if some early discoveries were one-way trips pushed along by favorable winds. Either way, these breezes became highways carved into the sky. The quirky tidbit? Some oral traditions describe the trade winds as fickle personalities, sometimes generous grandmothers, sometimes trickster uncles. Sailors would talk to the wind, begging it to shift or calm, as though negotiating with a stubborn relative. It sounds like folklore, but when you live on the mercy of invisible air currents, giving them names and moods helps make sense of the chaos. You stand now, letting the wind push at your chest. The sail above you bellies out, snapping slightly, then filling again. You realize the canoe doesn't just rely on swells, it's also dancing with the wind. To steer here, you don't crank a wheel. You shift your whole body, pulling the steering paddle, adjusting the sail. Every muscle becomes part of the choreography. The trade winds are both blessing and curse. They'll carry you swiftly westward, but here's the catch: you've got to return somehow. And heading back against the trades is no small feat. That's where knowledge of swells, stars, and cunning tacks against the wind become crucial. You picture an apprentice navigator being drilled on this. Don't just ride the trades, outsmart them. If you can't return, you've failed the voyage. Historians still argue whether Polynesian voyagers launched with the confidence of a planned round trip, or whether some journeys were gambles, trusting that the trades would eventually carry them to new land without much thought of return. The romantic in you wants to believe they were deliberate masters. The realist in you wonders if sometimes desperation and luck were as important as skill. The wind presses harder now, and the canoe responds, slicing across the surface with a hiss of foam. You grip the edge and realize something startling. The swells and the wind aren't competing forces, they're partners. The trades push the surface waves, while the deep swells march steadily underneath. Together, they create a layered song, a harmony you're just beginning to recognize. One more quirky story drifts your way. Some navigators claimed they could smell the wind. Not just the salt, but the faint scent of islands carried on the breeze. Palm pollen, volcanic soil, even bird droppings. All of it supposedly detectable on a steady trade wind if you were sensitive enough. Skeptics roll their eyes, but modern science has shown that airborne particles can indeed travel for miles over the sea. Whether a human nose can really detect them in practice, that remains one of those mysteries scholars debate while sipping coffee in air-conditioned offices. You lean back, letting the wind tousle your hair, and you realize this invisible force is as much a road as the swells beneath you. The trade winds don't just push, you learn to lean into them, to anticipate their steady grip. For a navigator, ignoring them would be like ignoring gravity. The day stretches bright and hot now, the horizon a shimmering line of silver fire. The sail hums, the rigging creaks, and the canoe rushes forward, perfectly balanced between swell and wind. You can almost hear the ancestors whisper, "Breathe with the trades, steer with the swells, and the ocean will carry you home." The sun sits high now, blazing against the water so fiercely that the horizon seems to ripple like molten glass. You squint, hand shading your eyes, and for a dizzying moment it looks as though the whole ocean is moving in two directions at once. And in truth, it is. This is the secret of the cross swell, one of the most vital, confusing, and fascinating tricks a Polynesian navigator has to master. Your canoe dips with a long, steady rhythm, rocking from east to west. But then, layered on top, there's a different motion, shorter, sharper, tugging at an angle. It's like walking down a hallway while someone shoves your shoulder sideways every few steps. At first it feels chaotic, like the sea is playing a prank. But to the trained navigator, cross swells are not chaos. They're crossroads. They mean that somewhere out there, two forces have collided, two distant storms, two wind systems, or maybe the silent shadow of land bending the waves. Mainstream historical fact. Oceanographers today confirm that swells often travel thousands of miles intact, crossing and overlaying one another in complex patterns. A navigator who could detect and interpret these intersections effectively had a mental map of the Pacific's invisible highways. Historians still argue whether Polynesian sailors had a full mental chart of intersecting swell zones, or whether they navigated purely through memory of experience on specific routes. Here's a quirky tidbit. Revival navigators sometimes describe cross swells using human metaphors like the mother and the child arguing, or two drummers refusing to keep the same beat. One swell might dominate in strength, the other faint but insistent. The navigator's job, to figure out which voice to follow, and when. You crouch low again, palms flat against the deck. The canoe rocks in that double rhythm, and soon your body is confused. Your spine feels one swell, your hips another. You close your eyes, trying to sort them out. The long, slow roll to the west is steady, dependable. But the sharper push from the south nags at you, tapping out a counterbeat. If you let the canoe drift without discipline, it might follow the wrong one. That could mean days wasted, or worse, missing your target island entirely. Imagine a master navigator training an apprentice. He says nothing, just watches as the younger sailor frowns, lies down, sits up again, tries to interpret the conflicting rhythms. Hours pass. Finally, the apprentice whispers, "Two swells." The master grunts approval. Next step, identify them. Where is each one coming from? Which is dominant? Which matches the star paths overhead? The cross swell is not just a curiosity. It's a test, the kind of exam you don't pass with paper and pencil, but with skin, nerves, and survival on the line. Historians still argue about how far these intersections were deliberately used to find islands. Some suggest cross swells were only navigational background noise. Others believe they were deliberate signposts, subtle markers that an island lay just beyond sight, bending and reflecting one set of waves into another. You press your hand harder to the deck, and for a moment you can believe the latter. The ocean doesn't just roll aimlessly. It collides, it reflects, it remembers. Here's something to amuse your sleepy brain. Sailors once joked that if you could balance a coconut on the deck and watch it roll, you could map the cross swells. If it wobbled forward and back, you followed one swell. If it jittered sideways, you followed another. Of course, real navigators didn't need coconuts. They had their bones. But the image sticks, doesn't it? A coconut compass, rolling lazily, telling you which way the sea breathes. The sun continues its assault, and the water flashes so brightly you have to squint until your eyes water. Yet even blinded, your body knows the truth of the swells. The canoe rocks on two rhythms, layered but not random, and slowly you start to separate them in your mind. You imagine one line stretching away eastward to the storm that birthed it, the other southward, maybe bouncing from an island unseen. Together, they sketch an X across the Pacific, and you're sitting at its very center. That thought is humbling. In a sea this vast, to find yourself at the crossing of invisible lines, like threads woven into a cosmic net, it makes you feel both tiny and infinite. The Polynesian navigator lived in that paradox. Lost but never lost. Drifting but always guided. You sit back up, wiping salt from your lips, and glance at the sail. It flutters, steady in the trades, while beneath you the swells continue their double song. Somewhere out there, those crossing waves point the way. You're beginning to trust them, not blindly, but with the quiet confidence that the ocean's riddles always have answers, if you listen long enough. The day ripens into that glaring, heat-shimmering stretch when the sky seems to buzz, and the sea looks like polished glass hammered into ripples. You squint into it, sweat drying salty on your skin, when suddenly, you feel something different under the canoe. The steady rhythm of the swell stutters, like a song catching on a scratch. You lean closer to the deck, palms pressed flat, and there it is again, a faint, unusual beat, as if the ocean is whispering back. This is the navigator's secret weapon, reflected waves from land. You can't see the island yet, not even a smear of green against the horizon, but you can feel its presence. When swells hit a shore, they bounce. That echo doesn't vanish. It travels back across the sea, a ghostly ripple that a master can sense through the canoe's bones. Out here, in the vast emptiness of the Pacific, that faint reflection could mean the difference between salvation and endless drift. Mainstream historical fact. Modern experiments with traditional navigators, including the legendary Maupialag of Micronesia, confirmed that reflected swells are detectable to a trained body. Mau could identify the backwash of islands dozens of miles before land came into view, purely by lying on his canoe and feeling the shifts. Historians still argue whether this was the universal method of Polynesian discovery, or one of several overlapping techniques used only by the most skilled. The quirky tidbit? Some oral traditions described these reflected swells as island shadows. Not shadows of light, but of water. The idea was that every island, no matter how small, cast an invisible shape across the sea. You couldn't see it, but you could drift into it, like stepping into a faint aura. Islanders claimed that great masters could see these shadows even in their dreams, tracing routes long before a voyage began. You lie flat again, cheek pressed against the warm wood. The regular east-west swell rocks you steadily, but layered faintly beneath it, you detect something wrong, a hiccup, a push back against the rhythm. It's faint, almost like a hand brushing against your palm when you weren't expecting it. The apprentice navigator would be drilled endlessly on this sensation, until he could tell the difference between a true reflected swell and ordinary chop. One mistake, one false echo, and a canoe could drift days off course. The reflection doesn't just tell you land is there, it tells you where. If the echo comes from your left side, land lies that way. If it comes from the bow, it's ahead. You can even estimate distance by strength. Close echoes feel sharper, almost like the canoe is walking into its own footsteps. Distant echoes are soft, stretched, like memories fading. You try to feel this now, imagining that a volcanic island lies beyond the horizon, its cliffs throwing back a watery hello. Historians still argue whether navigators relied more on stars, birds, or swell reflections when searching for islands. Some insist the reflected wave method was too subtle to be dependable. Others point to accounts of sailors arriving exactly where they intended, insisting that only a sensory method like this could explain such precision. The debate lingers, but your skin right now doesn't care. It swears something is different beneath you. Here's a quirky little image. Some navigators supposedly described reflected swells as the laughter of islands. Imagine a stone wall echoing your voice in a canyon. Now imagine an island laughing back at the waves hurled against it. You're lying on your canoe, listening for that laughter, soft, watery chuckles that only the patient can hear. The heat of the day presses heavy, but you barely notice anymore. You're caught in the strange thrill of realizing that land, invisible land, can announce itself long before sight. That faint double beat beneath the main swell is more comforting than the sight of distant stars. It means food, shelter, safety are near. It means that the ocean itself isn't empty. It's crowded with the invisible fingerprints of islands. For a moment, you close your eyes and let the rhythm carry you. The regular swell, the faint echo, the gentle hush of wind in the rigging. It's hypnotic, like listening to two drummers far apart, answering each other across the sea. And you, perched between them, are the only one awake enough to hear both sides. The horizon still looks blank, a searing line of blue and silver. But in your body, in the canoe, you already know, land is out there. The ocean has told you. You just had to learn how to listen. The afternoon deepens, the heat pressing down like a heavy cloak, when you notice another sign, this time not from the swell beneath you, but from the air above. A dark smudge wavers on the horizon. At first you think it's a trick of light, one of those shimmering mirages that make sailors doubt their sanity. But as you stare longer, the smudge shifts, rises, vanishes, then returns. You're seeing cloud formations, and not just any clouds, the kind that gather loyally above islands. Navigators prized clouds as much as swells. Islands, especially lush volcanic ones, pump moist air skyward, forming towering cumulus by day and glowing anvils by evening. Even from dozens of miles away, when no tree or shoreline is visible, the sky betrays what the sea conceals. You tilt your head, studying that faint tower of white, imagining the jungle below breathing it upward. Mainstream historical fact. Explorers like Captain Cook recorded how Polynesian sailors pointed out clouds as indicators of land long before it was visible. Modern meteorology confirms that low-lying atolls can still generate distinctive cloud patterns, often darker bases or puffy clusters that drift little because they're anchored by the island's thermal activity. Historians still argue whether ancient navigators recognized every type of island cloud systematically, or whether they learned them through regional familiarity only. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some traditions claim the gods themselves placed a cap of cloud on their chosen islands, like a hat marking home. Navigators joked that if you were lost, you just needed to look for the island's hat. Of course, the trick was spotting the right hat in a sky cluttered with decoys. You notice how the base of the smudge seems darker, tinged almost green-gray. That's another giveaway. Clouds above islands reflect the lush forest below, giving their undersides a subtle tint compared to the paler clouds over open water. Your eyes dart from patch to patch, comparing shades, searching for that secret island hue. But clouds don't just mark land, they guide timing. By day, clouds rise tall and fluffy, pointing like arrows. At night, they flatten, glowing softly in moonlight, their reflection on the water betraying islands, even when the land is invisible in the dark. Imagine a canoe slipping silently across the waves under starlight, guided not by what's above the water, but by the faint glow mirrored in the clouds. Historians still argue how reliable this method was at extreme distances. Some point out that clouds can form over open sea, fooled by shifting air currents. Others argue that the specific, consistent way island clouds cluster makes them unmistakable to a trained navigator. Either way, you can feel the thrill. Out here in a desert of blue, even a hint of extra puff in the sky feels like a lifeline. Here's something fun. You probably never thought of clouds as gossiping, but navigators sometimes spoke of them that way. One cloud would whisper of water beneath it, another would boast of tall mountains, while thin wisps were dismissed as liars. Sitting on your canoe, scanning the horizon, you're eavesdropping on the sky's endless chatter. The smudge grows as the sun shifts lower, until it's unmistakable, a tower rising where no tower should be. Your body tingles with anticipation. It might still be hours before landfall, but already your mind can smell damp earth. Imagine the chirp of island birds, feel sand beneath tired feet. The ocean may carry you, but the sky, the sky, announces where your journey will end. You recline for a moment, letting the canoe rock beneath you, gaze fixed on that loyal smudge. The swell beneath you still mutters, the breeze still sighs, but above it all the clouds stand sentinel. The Pacific may be wide, But the heavens are never silent about where life hides. You just have to learn how to read their gossip. You're still riding the long afternoon sway when a small dark shape wheels into sight above the horizon. No, not a ship, a bird. It's the first bird you've seen in hours, and immediately your stomach does a small, hopeful flip. Birds are the cheap, unflashy miracle of ocean navigation. They don't carry compasses, but they carry home. A single frigate or turn becomes a walking, or rather flying, hint that land exists within reach. You watch its lazy arcs with a kind of reverent irritation. How can something so commonplace rewrite your evening? There's a straightforward reason for this. Many seabirds have predictable foraging distances from their roosts. Frigate birds, those ragged-winged pirates who never land on the sea, must return to islands to roost, so seeing one unusually far out implies a land base within its daily range. Nadas and terns commute between feeding grounds and nesting colonies. Shearwaters and petrels make long looping sorties, but almost always return to shore. Spotting their flight path, timing its return, and noting which species you're watching gives you not only the presence of land, but clues about its size and distance. You remember the island hat we talked about, the cloud cap puffing proudly over a volcanic spine. Birds and clouds are ancient partners. When an island throws up a tower of cumulus, it also throws up a population of birds that circle above and dive into nearby feeding grounds. You could use the birds to confirm the clouds' gossip. If both the sky and the air agree, you've got something real. It's a lovely, triangular confirmation. Reflected swell whispers, clouds puff a hat, and birds trace the edges. Together they make a small chorus that's louder than any single cue. There's a mainstream historical fact to tuck under your pillow. Voyaging accounts and later ethnographic observations record that Polynesian navigators watched birds to find land, sometimes following them until the birds changed from foraging loops into direct flights toward home. Historians still argue whether bird following alone was ever relied upon as a primary discovery method, or whether it was one of several overlapping cues used together with swells, stars, and cloud patterns. The debate isn't just academic. How you weight each clue changes how you read the whole ocean. You crane your neck and track the way this bird flies. At first it wheeled in lazy circles, scanning the water. Then it took an arrow straight line inland. That shift, lazy to direct, is exactly what you hope for. It means the bird has finished feeding and is heading home. If you follow that homeward vector, you are likely to intersect the land before nightfall. In practice, a navigator would watch several birds, because species have different habits. Frigate birds will range far but always need land. Nadas and terns make shorter commutes. A tropic bird's keening dive suggests reefs teeming with small fish. Each species is a different kind of hint. There's a slightly eccentric story some elders like to tell at the edge of the taro patch. They say that on certain voyages the crew would listen for the music of birds, the pattern of wing beats and calls, as though each island sang with a different choir. It sounds like poetic embellishment, but there's a grain of truth inside. Different species do have distinct calls and flight styles, and a seasoned ear can tell a tropic bird's thin keening from a tern's staccato chatter before the eye confirms it. Whether that sensitivity was taught formally or acquired by long exposure is part of the human mystery. Some people simply notice more. You start to pick up the rhythms. One bird swoops low, skimming surface life. Another flutters higher, drifting like a sentry. If multiple birds begin to commute toward a single vanish point on the horizon, you mentally triangulate. Where the swells hinted at a reflected echo and clouds wore an island hat, now the birds give you a human-scale clue. You're closer than the swell suggested, but not so close you can taste the coconuts yet. It's a layering of evidence, like stacking transparent maps, until a single island silhouette appears in relief. There's also an improvisational trick sometimes mentioned in passing. Release a small bird from the canoe and watch which way it goes. If it heads inland, you've got a bearing. If it circles back to sea, you're likely stranded. Ethnographers recorded such anecdotes in various island cultures. though whether Polynesian navigators systematically used captive birds in planned voyages is still debated. It sounds risky and a touch desperate, but desperate times call for desperate navigation. You decide you'd rather follow freely flying birds than gamble on a stressed captive one. The birds also give time sense. A frigate bird sighted at mid-morning and still circling at noon might have come a long way from a big island. A flock that leaves at mid-afternoon and never returns by dusk suggests the roost is beyond your night reach. Experienced navigators would use the bird's daily schedules as a clock. If the bird returns to land at dusk, you can estimate how long you have to reach shore. That kind of bodily scheduling, paying attention to living rhythms rather than a written chronometer, turns the natural world into a practical timepiece. You think of the apprentices back in Section 4, pinned to the hull, learning the swell like a new language. Here, birds are punctuation marks in that language, commas and exclamation points that shape the flow of a sentence. When the swell forms a line and the clouds puff an island hat, and then you see a scatter of terns arrowing inland, your sentence completes. Land ahead left, maybe 3 hours paddle. It's satisfying, the way separate sensory clues converge into a single actionable plan. You like that clarity. The ocean gives you complexity, and the birds hand you a neat summary. There's a fringe tidbit you'll like. A few storytellers claim some navigators could imitate bird calls well enough to draw curious terns closer, or to get a nod to give away its route. It sounds like a campfire lie until you remember that humans everywhere sometimes mimic birds for hunting. Why would sailors be the only ones not to try? Skepticism is healthy. Historians still argue about whether imitation ever formed part of a navigator's toolkit, or whether such tales are later flourishes added to make the old stories smell sweeter. For your part, you hum a poor imitation and watch a tern give you the polite glare of a creature who has seen humans try to talk before. As the afternoon droops toward evening, the light narrows and the bird patterns become urgent. Multiple silhouettes now begin converging toward a single rise in the horizon. Your heart, a meditational metronome for the voyage, speeds up in a way you let be a small, guilty pleasure. There's a practical, almost clinical side to this excitement. Follow them, test their vector against the swells, measure the cloud hat, and don't trust a single indicator. The ocean gives you redundancy. The clever navigator uses it. You remember the coconut compass, joke from Section 6. The idea of watching a coconut roll as a crude detector. Birds make the better coconut. Alive, mobile, and infinitely more communicative. You follow the birds, steering gently to match the line of their return. The canoe responds smoothly. The outrigger hums. Each pull of the paddle is measured, patient. You feel like a cartographer rewriting a map with each breath, tracing routes that have already been walked by feathered strangers. Sometimes birds mislead. Floating mats of seaweed, drifting logs, or shoals of fish can create a false chorus. A clever navigator reads whether the birds soar purposefully toward a roost or hunt in a scatter. The difference saves days. Modern bird tracking quietly confirms that many seabirds keep surprisingly regular circuits tied to specific islands, a scientific echo of old knowledge. That confirmation doesn't change the poetry. It only makes your faith feel less like superstition and more like a practiced skill. You ease back now, letting the canoe carry you on the bearing the birds set. The sun thins, the silhouettes tighten, and for a long moment you feel gratitude that the world made creatures like this, small, feathered signposts that can break the ocean's loneliness. Their casual flapping has more strategic value than a map tucked in a judge's pocket. You close your eyes and for the first time that day allow yourself to imagine the smear of green ahead. Palms, smoke, a shouted greeting. It's almost enough to make you forget you once thought stars were the only maps that mattered. Evening begins to stretch her long shadow over the sea, and the birds you've been watching gradually fade back toward the horizon, their silhouettes swallowed by the dimming sky. The swell beneath you is steady, the sail whispers, and your eyes begin to ache from squinting. Just when you think the world is settling into darkness, a soft smear of green-gray appears ahead. faint at first, like a bruise on the horizon. You lean forward, hardly daring to blink. The island is announcing itself, not by shape, not by color, but by smell. It comes in waves, subtle at first. A damp, leafy tang that feels out of place after days of salt and sun. You sniff again, and this time there's something earthy, almost sweet, like fresh-cut grass mixed with smoke. Your mind reels because this is how Polynesian navigators sometimes confirmed landfall, not by sight, but by scent carried over water. Mainstream historical fact. Sailors throughout history recorded the experience of smelling land before seeing it. Polynesian canoes, riding low and open, gave their crews direct exposure to the breeze, which could carry the aromas of forest, soil, and even bird colonies dozens of miles offshore. Historians still argue whether navigators systematically used scent as a navigational cue, or whether it was an incidental thrill, a happy accident that confirmed what swells and birds had already promised. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some oral traditions spoke of islands having their own breath. One smelled of flowers, another of fire, another of damp stone. Navigators supposedly joked that you could travel blindfolded and still know where you were by the island's breath. The idea feels romantic, but sitting here, nostrils flaring against the dusk wind, you can almost believe it. You shift on the deck, body swaying with the canoe, and concentrate. The trade wind blows steadily into your face. On it rides the faint aroma of vegetation, richer than anything the open sea could create. You imagine whole forests exhaling together, their breath rising, spreading, and being carried like an invisible flag across the ocean. The more you inhale, the clearer it seems. Somewhere ahead, beyond the swell, beyond the darkening horizon, lies land. Historians still argue whether this sense was reliable across long voyages. Some claim scent couldn't possibly travel far enough to be trusted. Others argue that on a still evening with steady winds, the aroma of a large island could reach surprisingly far. You picture navigators disagreeing about this centuries ago, one swearing he could smell coconuts, another rolling his eyes. But in practice, when you're desperate for proof, you'll take every whisper the ocean gives you. Here's something strange. Old anecdotes mention sailors deliberately wetting cloth and waving it in the air to catch smells, then wringing it out and sniffing. It sounds absurd, like trying to squeeze perfume from the wind, but the ritual alone shows how seriously the possibility of scent was taken. Whether it worked or not, it made the crew more attentive, noses tilted toward promise. You lean back and close your eyes, letting your nose lead. The salt-crusted air is softer now, tinged with organic life. There's smoke in it too, faint but unmistakable, perhaps a cooking fire drifting far out. That smell is intimate, human. For a moment, you imagine families on shore, not knowing their invisible signal is already reaching strangers across the sea. It feels oddly comforting, like overhearing laughter from a neighboring house late at night. The canoe creaks as it rides the swells, and you breathe deeper, filling your lungs with proof. You don't have to see land yet. You can smell it. This is no mirage, no guesswork. It's the earth itself, sending a scented handshake across the darkening waters. And you, stretched out on this narrow craft, are the one lucky enough to notice. The last glow of daylight slips into violet haze, and the stars begin to flicker awake above you. The swell still presses steadily at your hull. The faint smell of land lingers on the wind, but now your eyes are drawn skyward. Because if the ocean is the navigator's skin, and the birds are the whispers, then the night sky is the great library. Each star a letter, each constellation a sentence in a language carved across time. You crane your neck, letting the darkness sharpen the points of light, and you remember how Polynesian voyagers trained for this moment. They didn't use a compass. They were the compass, storing entire skies in memory. Every bright star had its rising point and its setting point etched deep into their minds, aligned with the directions of the ocean. You don't measure them with tools. You memorize where they climb and where they vanish, and those invisible paths become your highways. Mainstream historical fact. Navigators divided the horizon into star houses, specific rising and setting places that marked direction. Stars such as Sirius, Altair, or Canopus weren't just distant suns. They were coordinates, consistent markers across generations of voyages. Historians still argue whether Polynesians mapped every visible star or primarily used a curated set of the brightest, most dependable ones. Either way, their star compasses rivaled any parchment chart in detail. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some traditions named the rising stars as if they were guests stepping onto the stage, and the setting ones as if they were weary travelers going home. Sirius enters the house, Canopus leaves the house. Phrases like these made the sky feel like a bustling neighborhood, busy with nightly comings and goings. You tilt your head and trace an arc from east to west. There, Sirius climbs, brilliant and sharp, a perfect guide to the south. To your left, Orion flexes across the darkness, belt stars lined like stepping stones. Each of these points will sink eventually, and you know precisely where. Imagine an apprentice standing beside his teacher, both staring at the sky, the elder pointing with his chin. See where Aldebaran rose? That's your bearing. Follow it until morning. Historians still argue whether navigators held these star paths as rigid compass lines, or more as fluid memories reinforced with swells and clouds. Perhaps the answer is both. Memory is backbone, the sea is flesh. Either way, as you watch star after star find its place, you realize the truth. No matter how far from land, you are never far from directions. You settle deeper into the canoe, letting the rhythm of swells combine with the rhythm of stars. The sea moves beneath you, the sky turns above you, and you are pinned between two enormous clocks. This is why voyagers could travel thousands of miles. Not because they trusted chance, but because they trusted the sky's consistency. And maybe you smile a little now, because in your own modern life, streetlights and glowing screens have smothered this ancient map. You probably couldn't even pick out Canopus if asked. But here, afloat in dark water, the stars are as clear as braille for the eyes. You feel them press into your mind, luminous fingerprints, promising you'll never be entirely lost if you keep watching. So you breathe, and you keep your gaze fixed on the sky. The canoe rocks beneath, the swell hums steadily, but the stars, those old companions, chart a path you could follow forever. The night has fully blossomed now, the kind of ink-black canopy you only get far from land, far from artificial light. You lie back against the deck, your spine pressed to the canoe's ribs, and feel how the sea's rhythm matches the slow pulse of your own body. Overhead, the stars are no longer scattered dots, they are pathways. You realize something crucial. It isn't just single stars that guide Polynesian navigators. It's whole constellations, moving together like luminous caravans across the sky. You tilt your head and catch Orion again, its belt still cutting a sharp diagonal across the heavens. To you it might be a hunter, but to navigators of the Pacific it was also a kind of measuring stick. From his belt you can trace the line to Sirius, to Aldebaran, to the Pleiades, like beads on an invisible thread. Each star cluster is a signpost, but together they form highways that stretch across the ocean. Mainstream historical fact. Polynesian navigators built what is often called a star compass, dividing the horizon into 32 or more houses, each marked by the rising and setting of specific stars or star clusters. The constellations anchored these houses, creating a lattice that told direction even in the middle of the endless Pacific. Historians still argue whether these compasses were standardized across cultures or customized region by region. Some evidence suggests a shared template. Others suggest each island group tuned the system to their own sky. Here's a quirky tidbit. Oral teachings sometimes gave each star house a personality. One was a house of laughter, another the house of mourning. Apprentices were told that a voyage wasn't just movement through water, but through these cosmic neighborhoods, each one with its own mood. Imagine sailing through a star street where the Pleiades rise, and being reminded, you're entering a playful district. Stay alert, but enjoy the ride. You follow the Pleiades now, that small shimmering cluster, their light soft but unmistakable. They have always been storytellers. Ancient Greek farmers read them for planting seasons, and Pacific navigators read them for steering across black water. As they lift higher, you note how their rising point marks east-northeast, a detail etched into memory like a road sign you pass daily on your commute. Historians still argue whether voyagers memorized the stars through endless rote repetition or through story chains linking one to the next. Evidence suggests both. Repetition drilled the points into muscle memory, while myths stitched them together, giving the sky a narrative that was easier to recall. You imagine a sleepy apprentice struggling to stay awake on deck, only to be jostled by a master murmuring, "Follow the tail. Where does the hunter chase the bird? Where does the bird fly?" That's where your next direction lies. The quirky truth is that constellations weren't universal across Polynesia. One navigator might see a canoe in the stars where another saw a fish. But the practical rising and setting points remained the same, no matter the name. The stars didn't care what story you told about them. They always kept their appointments on the horizon. Lying there, you feel a deep calm. Every few minutes another star slides down into its western house, while a new one emerges in the east. It's like watching friends take shifts on watch duty. One bows, another steps forward, and the performance never falters. You don't even need to count time with a clock. The constellations are your hours, each rising a new chapter of the night, each setting a reminder of progress. Your body rocks with the canoe, the swells beneath still steady, and you glance once more at the belt of Orion, at the glow of Canopus low on the horizon. The sea is vast, but the sky is vaster, and somehow it folds neatly into your memory, a portable atlas etched into bone and breath. Night has a funny way of stealing the obvious and leaving the important. As the sun drops and the sky swallows color whole, your eyes unclench and the world sharpens into other senses. Out here on the open Pacific, that change isn't a handicap, it's a gift. In darkness, the sea's small lies fall away. The big, true rhythms stand up and announce themselves. You notice this first as a subtle relief. There is no glare to blind you, no shimmering heat haze to trick your eye, only the honest pulse of long-period swells that have been traveling for days and that now read themselves directly into your bones. Without visual clutter, the swell becomes a voice you can finally hear. Polynesian navigators favored darkness for practical reasons. The star compass is at its clearest against black. A bright star marks a rising point like a fixed spike on the horizon you can mentally peg. At the same time, surface winds often ease after dusk, smoothing short chop and revealing the deep swell train that retains signatures of distant storms. The paradox tastes sweet. Strip away daytime distraction, and the ocean's memory becomes legible to the skin. That is why so many long legs were run through the night, because the important signals are easier to read when the world isn't shouting. A straightforward historical fact anchors you here. Ethnographers and early observers recorded that crews deliberately timed critical stretches of voyaging for hours after sunset, when stars, swells, and cooler air combined to make navigation more reliably readable. Chants and oral instructions reference night watches and star rites. Historians still argue whether night voyaging was a universal norm across all Polynesian routes or a regional preference optimized to local wind and sky patterns. But the evidence that the night mattered is solid and repeated across islands. You lie flat on the deck, cheek against warm wood, and let your body do the work. The hull hums like a large, gentle instrument. Press your palm to the plank and you feel the swells phase marching under you, a long, regular 1-2 that tells of a distant storm's heartbeat. A reflected swell brushes the port side, and your pelvis registers the subtle delay like a musician counting off a syncopated bar. Where daylight forces you to parse movement into visual snapshots, night collapses motion into continuous sensation, a textured language your nervous system reads as if it were braille. There's a small, almost theatrical teaching custom you'll hear from elders. Apprentices were sometimes blindfolded and made to lie on deck through whole moonless watches until their bodies remembered the sea. Masters claimed sight could deceive. The body must learn first to trust the canoe. It sounds extreme, and perhaps it was, But modern tests with revival navigators show there is real value to the practice. Removing sight forces compensation by touch and balance and trains the brain to interpret microvibrations. When you take sight away, hearing refines, touch becomes discriminating, and the vestibular system grows precise. A recurring scholarly debate keeps surfacing. Does night navigation privilege instinct over calculable technique? Some researchers argue the methods were instrumental, repeatable, teachable, describable in procedural steps, while others emphasize tacit knowledge, the kind you cannot fully capture on paper. The way a certain hull vibration foretells an island 30 miles away, or the pattern of a cloud's silhouette against starlight that only experience can decode. Historians still argue whether the craft's core was codified rules or embodied intuition, and the answer likely leans toward a blend. Frameworks to guide, apprenticeship to make them live inside the body. Biological cues change after dusk, too. Insects from distant atolls hum like a faint radio, and the calls of nocturnal birds punctuate the dark. If land is near, animal activity alters predictably at dusk. Herons loaf differently, not as tight in their circuits, terns make final runs, so a trained ear can add living evidence to the physical chorus. Night air carries scent more clearly because cooler temperatures reduce turbulence. Smoke, damp earth, and the oily tang of kelp ride low and reach the canoe with a fidelity that daylight disperses. The dark thus hands you an amplified set of living signals to layer atop swell and star evidence. But darkness is not risk-free. That same lack of visual cues that clarifies swells can hide hazards like sudden shoals, tumbled breakers, or deceptive eddies near reefs. A novice might mistake a reflected swell for a direct one when there is no visual anchor. That is why redundancy is doctrine. The teacher's mantra is a threefold check: stars against swells, swells against birds, birds against clouds. Never accept a single sense. Masters drilled this into apprentices with a sternness that softened only with time. If the swell says island and the stars disagree, stop and test again. Historians still argue over how strictly such redundancies were enforced in all voyages. You practice on a long watch. Close your eyes and catalog the body's small adjustments. A subtle roll as two swell trains cross, a gentle staccato under the aft beams as short wind chop arrives, a soft returning pressure on the port side that suggests a reflected echo. Those microdifferences accumulate into decisions. When to steer a few degrees off the line to meet an island's reflected swell straight on, when to heave to and wait for dawn. There is strategy and patience. Night navigation trains you to plan on feel rather than impulsive sight. Folklore dresses the night in wonder. Villagers tell stories of masters who could cross a reef barefoot in total dark and return to the canoe without a lantern, as if their feet had become eyes. Such tales are enchanting and slightly theatrical, but they point to a truth about expertise. Long, repeated exposure rewires perception into seeming miracle. A person who spends decades cataloging ocean acoustics, refining balance, and cataloging tiny differences will look to outsiders as if they possess supernatural senses. Whether it reads as magic or engineering depends on how loudly you want to romanticize things tonight. Moon phases complicate the bargain. A bright moon floods the sea with silver, exaggerating swell shadows and smoothing some cues while masking subtle reflected patterns. A moonless sky erases visual noise and forces you deeper into touch and memory. Masters insisted apprentices practice under every lunar condition: full moon, quarter, new moon, because each presents a different grammar. You learn to judge distance by how moonlight pools on a far reef rim, and to isolate a single star's climb by waiting for a brief clearing even under lunar glare. Adaptability is itself part of mastery. Social technology matters at night. Sleep on a canoe is strategic, negotiated, and shallow. Teams rotate, stories are whispered like liturgy, and one person always holds a slightly different state of wakefulness. Half asleep, half listening, which is surprisingly valuable. Minds in that liminal mode can detect patterns fully awake brains sometimes miss. The crew becomes an organism that distributes attention. Historians still argue about the precise social architecture. Was navigation centralized on a single master or distributed across multiple trained watchers? Ethnographic accounts suggest both models existed, adapted to the culture of each voyaging community. You develop small rituals to anchor the night. A whispered count for a favorite star as it arcs overhead, running a palm along the hull to check for temperature shifts, a single soft phrase that signals swell change without waking the whole crew. These micro-rituals are not superstition, but compressed communication channels designed for low-light, high-stakes work. They turn individual sensitivity into collective reliability and, over generations, solidify into the cultural practices that quietly ensure survival. Cloudy nights test the craft. When the sky banks over and stars hide, the navigator becomes an instrumentalist of other senses. The swell pattern, the calls of night birds, the thin sheen of bioluminescence that sometimes glows in the wake. Apprentices learn to mark time by minutes of quiet rather than by stellar landmarks, to notice how the mast sings as a wind slips past, and to register the tempo of crests with metronomic patience. Those cloudy watches are the exams that separate a confident navigator from a hopeful tourist. Dawn is the reward. When the first thin smear of pale blue edges the horizon, you feel a public, gentle relief. A remembered star dips, a bird breaks silhouette, and the swell confirms the bearing you maintained through the black. Historians still argue about how many ancient voyages used strict night-first legs for ritual reasons, meteorological advantage, or habit shaped by local climate. Different island groups likely answered differently. For you, lying with the hull humming beneath your cheek, the debate is academic. The night has taught you that listening closely makes you less lost than you ever thought possible. The first fingers of daylight stretch across the horizon, and the ocean, which had been whispering its secrets under the cloak of night, suddenly looks naked again. It's a dangerous trick the sun plays. You feel like you see everything, yet in truth you've just lost half your tools. Without the guiding stars, without the velvet dark that exaggerates swells and bird cries, you're left with brightness and glare. And in that glare, the thought creeps in. What if the original Polynesian voyagers didn't mean to get anywhere at all? What if they were simply pushed here, by wind, by storm, by drift, and stumbled upon new lands by sheer accident? That question haunts scholarship. It's been asked again and again by outsiders looking at the vastness of the Pacific. How could fragile canoes, lashed together by rope and prayers, cross thousands of miles on purpose? To skeptics in the 19th century, the idea of deliberate exploration seemed absurd. They preferred the drift theory. Islands populated by unlucky castaways blown off course, bobbing helplessly until they bumped into land. It's a tidy narrative, requiring no genius, no training, no long memories of wave and star. Just misfortune dressed up as settlement. But the more you lie here, feeling the canoe sway, the more that theory feels flimsy. For one thing, drift doesn't explain two-way voyages. The clear archaeological evidence that people not only reached new islands, but returned home with cargo, pigs, dogs, and stories. Drift might scatter survivors one way, but it doesn't get them back. A mainstream historical fact stands firm here. Radiocarbon dating shows that Polynesians systematically settled the farthest reaches of the Pacific, Hawaii, Rapa Nui, Aotearoa, within a narrow window between roughly 900 and 1200 CE. That speed implies design, not accident. Still, the debate refuses to die. Historians still argue whether the earliest landfalls, say, the leap from Samoa to the Cook Islands, were planned test voyages or lucky drifts that later inspired systematic journeys. Was it genius all along, or did genius only arrive after the first accidental discoveries? Here's a quirky tidbit. In the 1970s, a computer scientist tried to simulate drift voyages by dropping virtual canoes into modeled currents of the Pacific. The software spat out dozens of landfalls within weeks or months. The catch: the simulated canoes carried no pigs, no taro, no women, no navigators, just mathematical dots. Real migration requires families, livestock, plants, and the confidence to sail intentionally. That's the part algorithms never quite capture. You imagine yourself now as one of those supposed drift voyagers. A sudden gale, canvas shredded, sail lashed down, the canoe blown off course. Days pass, supplies dwindle, and morale frays. Maybe yes, land appears. Maybe palms shimmer green on the horizon. But could you really settle and thrive? Without preparation, without seeding stock, without chance of swell and star to guide a return? Even your skeptical brain feels the improbability. Drift might explain survival, but it doesn't explain civilization. And so you lean back, letting the debate roll in your head the way two swell trains collide under your hull. Accident or intent? Scholars trade blows in journals. Archaeologists dig up pig bones and adzes. Linguists trace word roots across thousands of miles. Yet here, on the canoe, the body leans instinctively toward intent. Too much precision in the stars, too much memory in the chance, too much cultural weight given to the navigator's art for this all to be luck. Still, there's something soothing in holding the possibility of both. Maybe the truth isn't either slash or. Maybe the very first leap was accident, a storm-pushed crossing that dropped someone somewhere unexpected. And maybe that accident lit the fuse, convincing generations after to train deliberately, to codify star paths and swell charts, to make the ocean less terrifying and more knowable. Historians still argue whether that's the actual story, but lying here, rocked by the sea, you admit it feels like a human one. The ocean around you glimmers with that flat, hard light that only midday can bring. The canoe creaks softly, and for the first time since you began this imagined voyage, you notice how your thoughts drift not just with the swells, but with arguments centuries old. Every island you've passed in your mind carries its own story of arrival. Every homeland you left behind carries its own tale of departure. And the scholars? They can't stop wrestling over which direction the great Polynesian voyages truly began. Mainstream historical fact. The Lapita people, ancestors of the Polynesians, carried their pottery, crops, and animals eastward across the Pacific around 1,500 to 500 BCE. Archaeological sites stretching from Melanesia into western Polynesia map that steady push. From those stepping stone islands, Polynesians eventually fanned out to Samoa, Tonga, and beyond. Yet even with pottery shards, carbon dates, and DNA evidence, the exact sequence of leaps remains tangled. Historians still argue whether Polynesians first struck north toward Hawaii, south toward Aotearoa, or east toward Rapa Nui, and whether those leaps were connected in one grand wave or separate bursts over centuries. Some argue west to east was the engine. In this view, voyagers started near island Southeast Asia, moved steadily outward through Melanesia, and then leapt across Polynesia in a bold surge. Others whisper of a reverse current. Small migrations perhaps came from the coast of South America, carrying sweet potatoes into Polynesia centuries before Europeans noticed the plant. Yes, that orange root complicates the story. The humble Camara showing up in Polynesia long before Western contact, its genetic fingerprints unmistakably Andean. Quirky tidbit? Thor Heyerdahl's famous Kon-Tiki raft in 1947. A Norwegian adventurer lashed together balsa logs and, with a crew of curious thrill-seekers, drifted from South America to Polynesia in 101 days. It made headlines, sold books, and sparked imaginations. Trouble was, it proved only that drifting was possible, not that it ever happened. Polynesian canoes weren't rafts. They were precision instruments built to sail against prevailing winds. Heyerdahl may have gotten publicity, but he didn't match the evidence of archaeology or oral tradition. Still, debates remain hot. Was the sweet potato carried east by Polynesians who touched South America, then ferried it back to their islands? Or was it South Americans drifting west with the tuber in their canoes, planting it in Polynesian soil? Historians still argue whether those contacts were rare accidents or repeated exchanges. Genetic studies of Polynesian chickens, South American plants, and even human DNA have given tantalizing hints of mingling, but no definitive verdict. You lean on the rail, scanning the imaginary horizon, and the tension feels real. Picture an academic conference. One speaker waving radiocarbon charts, another clutching linguistic maps, a third rolling their eyes and muttering about oral myths. Then imagine Polynesian elders in the audience, shaking their heads, knowing that their ancestors didn't drift anywhere by mistake. They steered. They trained. They memorized chants that locked thousands of miles of ocean into their minds. The scholarly quarrel is alive because it matters. To admit Polynesians were master navigators long before Europe's so-called age of discovery rewrites the story of human daring. To admit they may have even touched South America centuries before Columbus appends neat schoolbook timelines. And that unsettles people who prefer tidy boxes. But you, lying on this canoe, find comfort in the uncertainty. Whether east met west by accident, by drift, or by deliberate crossing, the Pacific becomes less a barrier and more a highway. You feel the swell rock you, steady as breath, and think, maybe the truth is bigger than any one theory. Maybe the ocean, with its endless horizons, has always demanded answers that are both slash and not either slash or. The swell under your canoe hasn't changed much, but the mood certainly has. After dwelling on scholarly quarrels and drift theories, your mind begins to notice how often the boundary between myth and method blurs out here. In daylight you might scoff at legends, but at night, with stars spilling across the black vault and the hull humming with invisible waves, those stories make a different kind of sense. Mainstream historical fact: Polynesian navigation was never divided into science and religion the way modern thought insists on splitting them. Chants, rituals, and myths were not decorative extras, but structural frameworks. The Navigators Guilds encoded their astronomical and oceanographic data into songs about gods, birds, and ancestors. This ensured the knowledge wasn't just functional but memorable, wrapped in story so it could survive generations without paper or ink. Imagine the god Tangaroa, Lord of the Sea, depicted in chant as both terrifying and nurturing. To call upon Tangaroa wasn't just to honor a deity, it was to remind yourself of the sea's dual nature: provider and destroyer, calm and cyclone. Mythic language carried practical reminders. You wouldn't forget to respect a storm if the storm itself was a god listening in. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some oral traditions, Maui, the same mischievous figure who fished islands out of the sea, was said to tug on the swells themselves, pulling them tighter or loosening them to trick other navigators. A playful way of saying, never trust a swell alone, always cross-check with stars. If Maui was tugging tonight, your job was to notice. Historians still argue whether myth came first as spiritual narrative, or whether it emerged later as mnemonic scaffolding to hold technical data. Did gods shape navigation, or did navigators invent gods to anchor their teachings? The line is blurry, and maybe that's the point. Separating the two might not even make sense in the cultural context of Polynesia, where cosmos, nature, and human craft braided into one rope. You imagine yourself chanting quietly now, not to beg favor, but to keep awake. Each line of verse reminds you of a star's rising, a bird's nesting habit, a current's pull. You sing about a shark, and that tells you to beware the reefs in this latitude. You praise a hero who crossed a horizon, and that locks in the memory of which star rose where. You may look like you're praying, but in truth you're rehearsing your chart. And myth serves another purpose: courage. Out here the Pacific is enormous, so enormous that your modern mind sometimes balks at the sheer scale. Myths wrap that bigness in familiarity. If the gods themselves crossed these waters, if heroes fished up islands with their bare hands, then surely your own little canoe can manage a few hundred miles. The sea rocks you gently, and you realize myth and method aren't rivals, they are companions. Together they keep knowledge sticky, courage steady, and voyagers alive. Maybe the scholars can keep their debates. You're busy remembering how Maui's tug warns you to double-check the swells. The swell presses steady beneath the canoe, and though your body feels lulled by its rhythm, your mind is about to be tested. Out here, training isn't a matter of comfort, it's a trial by exhaustion. You don't simply memorize swells, you live inside them, hour after hour, until your senses blur and your nerves threaten mutiny. The apprenticeship of a navigator was as much ordeal as education. Mainstream historical fact. In the traditional Micronesian and Polynesian schools of navigation, novices were kept awake through long watches, lying against the hull, tasked with identifying every cross-current, every reflected swell, every hint of change. Some training sessions lasted several days without true sleep. The idea wasn't cruelty, it was necessity. A navigator must learn to read the sea even when delirious, because voyages are rarely timed to your convenience. Picture it, you, stretched out on planks polished by salt and sun, eyelids aching to close. The master leans over and whispers, "Which swell speaks louder? Which one is false?" And you, groggy and trembling, must answer correctly. Get it wrong, and you repeat the drill again. Get it right, and you only earn another round. Fatigue carves patterns into memory far deeper than comfort ever could. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some traditions describe young apprentices being startled awake with splashes of cold seawater, or jolted by a sharp slap to the shoulder, the master barking, "Island ahead, prove it." The apprentice would grope in the dark for the subtle shift of the hull, naming the reflected swell that hinted at land. It was less a punishment and more a pop quiz, delivered with the sting of salt. Historians still argue whether these ordeals were standardized across Polynesia or varied wildly from island to island. Some accounts describe almost militaristic regimens, while others emphasize gentler, story-based instruction. Perhaps both were true, different islands, different teachers, different philosophies, but always the same demand: mastery born under pressure. You can feel the ordeal now as if it were your own. The stars blur above you, your head nods, but your hands grip the side of the canoe. The sea keeps rolling, endless, merciless, and the master's chant keeps pounding in your ears. Remember, remember, remember. Swell from the northeast, swell from the southwest, reflected echo from the northwest. Each pattern layered until your body itself becomes the mnemonic. Some nights the exhaustion wins. Apprentices stumble, confuse directions, swear that the canoe is turning when it isn't. And still the master makes them stay awake, to prove the sea can be trusted even when the mind falters. That's the ordeal's core lesson. Navigation is not about your comfort. It's about bending your fragile body into an instrument reliable enough to carry others across an ocean. And when dawn finally breaks, and the apprentice collapses, there is a paradoxical prize. What felt like torture in the moment turns out to be the glue that cements the knowledge forever. You'll never forget the swell that carried you through delirium. You'll never mistake the reflected echo that sang you awake in the middle of the blackest night. So you lie here now, imagining that sweat on your brow, that ache in your shoulders, that dry sting in your eyes. And you know, with a strange pride, that the ordeal was never cruelty. It was respect. Respect for the sea, respect for the ancestors, respect for the fragile, fallible human body that must become something more than human, an instrument tuned to swells and stars. The sky to the west bruises with thickening clouds, and before you even hear the wind building, you feel it in your chest, a low, restless thrum. The canoe rocks harder, and then, almost without warning, the sea erupts into chaos. The ordered rhythm of swells you've been studying for nights on end shatters into confusion. What had been your compass is now a jumble of slanting crests, cross-currents, and spray. This is the storm that every navigator fears, not simply for its violence, but for how it erases memory. Mainstream historical fact: storms can scramble the swell field of the Pacific for days, sometimes weeks. After a cyclone or typhoon, the usual long-period swells that carry distant information are chopped apart by wind seas, local refractions, and overlapping wave trains. Traditional navigators had to ride out these periods of disorientation, keeping their canoe steady while their primary tool, the swell compass, was effectively broken. You hunch low, bracing against the sting of salt spray. Your body, once so finely tuned to subtle shifts, now feels like a radio jammed with static. Every direction you lean seems wrong. The storm doesn't just batter the canoe, it batters your confidence. And that's the cruel trick. The storm doesn't only erase the sea's patterns, It tries to erase the navigator's certainty. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some traditions, navigators said that after a storm, the ocean could be angry and forgetful, like an elder waking from a fever dream. The idea was that you had to wait until the sea calmed enough to remember itself. Until then, you relied on stars, birds, and sheer patience. To keep moving blindly was arrogance. To hold still was wisdom. Historians still argue whether voyagers deliberately paused voyages during these confused seas, or whether survival sometimes forced them to continue regardless. Some oral histories describe canoes heaving to sails down, bows tied to drift safely until clarity returned. Others tell of desperate crossings through days of madness, crews praying that the sea would speak again before food ran out. You feel that tension now. Imagine lying against the sodden hull, trying to pick out a rhythm in the madness. One swell slams from the northeast, another jabs from the southwest, and then a third confuses your senses altogether. The master beside you murmurs, "Patience. Let the sea breathe again." And you realize the ordeal is not just physical, it's philosophical. You're being taught humility. You are not in charge here. The ocean will decide when to reveal her voice again. At night, you look to the stars, but the storm has smothered them. You listen for birds, but the wind drowns their calls. Even your sense of smell, so attuned to hints of land, becomes muddled by the rank odor of churned seaweed and brine. The world has gone noisy, and every instrument you trained has been detuned. And yet, there is a lesson tucked into this misery. You learn that knowledge is not just about precision, it's about waiting. The master navigator who panics when the sea goes silent is no master at all. The one who can sit still, eyes half closed, trusting memory until patterns slowly return. That's the true mark of skill. When the storm finally moves on, the sea doesn't clear instantly. The chop lingers, waves still argue with each other, but little by little you start to hear the old language again. A steady pulse pushes beneath the noise, like a drumbeat faint but undeniable. The ocean hasn't forgotten forever. It was only testing you. And in that moment, soaked, exhausted, half-broken, you realize storms aren't just obstacles. They are teachers. They remind you that mastery is fragile, that arrogance is deadly, and that patience is perhaps the truest compass of all. The storm has passed, but its ghost lingers. The swells are still muddled, and the air feels heavy with silence. You rest against the canoe's ribs and think about silence of another kind. The silence of centuries when these arts, once the lifeblood of Pacific travel, nearly disappeared. The long pause, scholars call it, though that phrase makes it sound tidy, like a scheduled intermission. In truth, it was more like a forgetting. Mainstream historical fact, between roughly 1300 and 1800 CE, the pace of Polynesian long-distance voyaging slowed dramatically. Archaeological traces of settlement show earlier centuries filled with bold expansions. Hawaii, Rapa Nui, and Aotearoa all reached within a few hundred years. But after that burst, expansion stopped. Voyages became shorter, local, confined mostly to inter-island routes within established archipelagos. Historians still argue whether climate change, resource stress, political upheaval, or cultural shifts caused the pause. You can almost imagine the reasons piling up. A cooling period, the so-called Little Ice Age, roughening seas and shortening growing seasons. Population pressures leading chiefs to focus inward, securing what land they already had. Canoe-building traditions waning as forests thinned, hardwood trees harder to find. The sea, once a highway, slowly recast as a barrier. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some islands, master navigators were buried with their secret chants, knowledge intentionally sealed away. Families guarded what remained as sacred, fearing it might be misused. By the time Europeans began mapping the Pacific, many islanders themselves had lost the long-distance methods, sailing mostly by coastal signs and memory of short routes. Imagine an entire library, once filled with living voices, locked away in a few fragile minds, and then those minds passing into the ground. Historians still argue whether this pause was total. Some evidence suggests rare long voyages still occurred, scattered like sparks, canoes drifting or intentionally making runs across Micronesia, Samoan navigators crossing far seas. Others insist the tradition all but died, preserved only in fragments until its late 20th century revival. Either way, the pause left gaps, and those gaps became wounds. You feel the ache of it as you picture generations growing up without the chance of stars, without the apprenticeship ordeals, without the swelling pride of steering by swells alone. Imagine children staring at the horizon with no words to describe its language. For centuries, the Pacific shrank, not in size, but in imagination. And yet, even in the forgetting, embers smoldered. Fishermen still felt swells under their hulls, even if they couldn't name them anymore. Grandmothers still sang fragments of chants, even if the constellations they described were dim with disuse. Knowledge never vanished completely. It just grew faint, like the ghost of a storm you can still hear in the background of the sea. You lie back and let that realization comfort you. The long pause wasn't an end. It was a sleep. And sleep, however deep, always leaves room for waking. The canoe that carries you now feels strange and timeless because it carries history inside its grain. Tonight, that history is personified by a man who walked out of an island village and into the modern world bearing a skill that seemed to others to belong to legend. His name is Mau Pielug. You learn Mao's name like a phone number you will never forget. Spoken quietly, repeated by a dozen voices across the deck, treated like an amulet. He comes from Satawal, a tiny Micronesian atoll where navigation was not a hobby, but an entire social technology, taught as carefully as planting breadfruit or carving an adze. In the revival of voyaging that reached across the Pacific in the late 20th century, Mau became the hinge, a single living repository who could teach, through story and touch, how to read the ocean as earlier generations once did. You begin where you always begin, lying flat, breathing slowly, pressing your cheek to the warm plank. But Mau's presence changes the tone. He does not lecture. He corrects with a hand on your shoulder, a tiny laugh, a clipped chant that fits the moment like a patch. He shows you how the hull speaks when a swell returns from a cliff face, how the spine of the canoe catches a back echo before your eyes have time to see anything. You watch his face as much as you listen and begin to understand that what he offers is not mere technique, but a mode of attention. He trains attention to be patient, curious, and unflinching. Mainstream historical fact: Mau Pielug, a master navigator from Satawal, famously taught Nainoa Thompson and other Hawaiian students in the mid-1970s. This training was central to the Hkli voyages and is widely credited with helping ignite the Polynesian voyaging renaissance. Historians still argue whether the late 20th century revivals are exact restorations of pre-contact practices or whether they are reconstructed, hybrid practices adapted to modern circumstances. An argument that matters when people claim to bring the past back, exactly as it once was. You try to copy his calm. He instructs with stories that are deceptively simple. A star becomes a character in one tale. A swell is an old friend in another. Those human stories are not decoration. They are mnemonic scaffolding. When he points to a faint point of light and names the bird that follows a star's rising, the information moves from abstract map into human habit. You begin to memorize because the story gives you texture, an image, a laugh, a bodily memory, and the knowledge survives nights of exhaustion. There's an almost tenderly odd detail you notice. Mau often used play and rhythm as teaching tools. He will clap a slow, even pulse that represents long-period swell and overlay a quicker clapping that represents local chop, asking students to echo the pattern. The effect is domestic and strangely powerful. Rhythm becomes a real-time translator between ocean physics and human bodies. Teaching navigation turns into teaching how to build a listening muscle, and rhythm is one of the best fitness regimes you can imagine for that muscle. Watching Mau teach also reveals a modern paradox. The vessels used in the revival were rebuilt with a mix of traditional technique and contemporary pragmatism. Wooden hulls shaped by traditional lines, but sometimes paired with modern ropes, safety gear, or small metal fittings when necessary. Historians still argue whether the feel of a reconstructed hull alters sensory feedback in crucial ways. Does a slightly different vibration change how a reflected swell feels under your ribs? And if it does that make the practice qualitatively different from whatever people did 1,000 years ago? The question matters to scholars, while for you it matters mainly because it forces humility. What you are learning is faithful, but not identical, to what preceded it. On a humid night, Mao asks you to close your eyes and forget the maps you were taught as a child. He taps the hull at measured intervals and asks you to say which direction the long swell comes from. Your first answers are wrong, awkward, shaped by city habits and indoor expectations. He does not berate, he nudges. A story, a grin, a chant, his corrections are surgical and humane. He teaches attention by retuning your nervous system, coaxing memory so that the skin of your feet and the ribs of your chest supply steady data even when your mind tries to wander. Anecdotes surround him. Journalists like a story of a man who could name an island by the way a swell nudged a canoe. You keep those tales in your head, but insulate them with a little common-sense skepticism. Rare skill looks miraculous to onlookers. Still, the stories perform a social function. They reset expectations, returning awe and respect to skills that were once ordinary. When a student narrates a landfall that followed only a swell echo and a cloud cap, people lean forward. The proof is not in grand proclamations. It is in the quiet, exact arrival at a reef where there was supposed to be a reef. Revival, as you experience it under Mao's supervision, is not only technical, it is cultural reclamation. The Hkli voyages and the teaching that came with them rebuilt a social ecology. Canoe yards returned to villages, elders found reasons to sing, youths found a purpose in suspense and repetition. Chant that had been tucked in the memory of a few became public again. Carpentry, ritual, star lore, forest stewardship, they began to recombine. You see how revival nudges communities to protect nyo stands and mature trees once harvested for hull timbers, because the craft requires living resources that modern economies had neglected. This ecological turn is part of the complexity. Critics say revival sometimes romanticizes a past that environmental change and social transformation no longer permit. Supporters argue that revival spurs stewardship and environmental awareness precisely because it reattaches human practices to living landscapes. Historians still argue whether revival should be seen mainly as cultural politics, environmental activism, or straightforward knowledge recovery. The answer depends on who is doing the revival, how they do it, and what local communities want. Mao's pedagogy is human scale. He pairs instruction with small rituals, a low, hummed tone that steadies breathing during a long watch, a soft joke to unlock panic, a mnemonic chant repeated until it sits in bone. These devices are not superstition, but social engineering. They compress complex knowledge into repeatable human acts, making it possible for someone who grew up in a different century or on a different island to adopt and adapt the craft. The public face of revival was messy and theatrical. Voyages were photographed, narrated, and sometimes turned into symbols in ways elders did not always like. Some worried that sacred practice would be flattened into spectacle. Others argued that visibility was necessary to gather resources and recruit youth. Historians still argue whether publicity risks turning social technology into performance, or whether it is indispensable for maintaining skills when the old apprenticeship patterns have been broken. Beyond spectacle, revival seeded long-term institutions. Language programs integrated chants, craft persons relearned ads techniques, community canoe yards reappeared. Young navigators who learned from Mao returned to shore not only with landfalls, but with teaching roles, with knowledge that bound them to place. The movement did not restore everything that was lost, and it could not fully rewind centuries of change, but it rebuilt relationships between people, craft, and the sea. There are tender jokes that linger. Students joked that Mao's low-hummed phrase was a charm that made the sea speak more clearly. The joke matters because it shared attention across a crew. It focused breath and slowed panic. Small shared devices like this are the scaffolding that makes fragile knowledge resilient when conditions are hostile. When you press your palm to the deck now, you feel the swell's soft insistence and the echo of all those lessons. Revival is not tidy. It is a conversation, a compromise between what survived in memory and what must be reimagined for a changed world. Mao gave technique, but he also gave an ethic. Navigation is a responsibility, a moral contract with those whose lives depend on your knowledge. Historians still argue about how precisely revival matches ancient practice, but on a night like this, with the hull humming and the teacher's low voice nearby, such debates feel academic. For you, the lesson is practical and immediate. Pay attention, hold the memory, pass it on. The canoe creaks forward, sails taut, and you realize revival is not just about one man like Mao. It is about a generation taking that ember and carrying it onward. From Hawaii to New Zealand, from Tahiti to Rapa Nui, island communities began to build their own voyaging canoes, each shaped by memory, research, and pride. The horizon that once shrank during the long pause suddenly swells open again, alive with the laughter of new crews learning old songs. Mainstream historical fact: the Polynesian Voyaging Society launched the double-hulled canoe Hkli in 1975, and after early struggles, it successfully voyaged to Tahiti in 1976 without modern instruments, guided by Mau Pialug and later by Nainoa Thompson. This voyage electrified the Pacific, sparking canoe projects across dozens of islands and helping to re-anchor identities in seafaring heritage. You feel it in your chest when you imagine the sight. A canoe gliding into Papeete Harbor, thousands cheering, elders weeping as though time had folded back on itself. That moment was more than a landfall. It was proof that the whispered stories were not fantasy, that their ancestors had indeed commanded the sea. Quirky tidbit: some crews experimented with mixing revival canoes and modern tools, jokingly calling GPS the lazy apprentice. On training runs, navigators sometimes turned off electronics completely, but still kept them tucked away for safety. The result was an odd hybrid, ancient methods tested alongside satellites, each voyage both performance and experiment. Historians still argue whether the Renaissance truly recaptured traditional ways, or if it created something new, a fusion of archaeology, oral tradition, and modern cultural politics. Some say the canoes became floating classrooms rather than exact replicas of ancestral expeditions. Others counter that authenticity matters less than continuity, that the sea cares more about whether you can listen than whether your lashings are precisely 12th century in style. As revival spread, communities found unexpected side effects. Youth who felt adrift in modern economies found direction in canoe work. Carvers reclaimed forests once slated for development, insisting that the land itself was part of the crew. Language teachers revived nautical vocabularies nearly lost, reminding children that words like star path or wave road belong to them. Voyaging became not just about the ocean, but about repairing social fabric torn by colonization and globalization. You picture yourself stepping ashore after weeks of swell reading, greeted not by silence but by drums and feasting, an entire island turning out to see their canoe return. The pride is contagious. You understand that navigation is not an isolated trick of memory. It is a performance of identity, carried in the body, the voice, the hull, and the community that waits at the shoreline. And as you close your eyes tonight, you hear it still, the ocean's voice, reawakened in dozens of places, swelling again after centuries of pause. The Renaissance is not finished. It is ongoing, alive, and you are part of its tide. The canoe rides smoother now, sails trimmed, crew steady, and your mind drifts from history into practice again. You've learned that revival isn't just about chanting star names. It's about how to live on the water day after day, learning to carry the sea in your bones until it becomes second nature. Out here, survival skills and navigation blur into one continuous rhythm. Mainstream historical fact: traditional Polynesian voyaging canoes carried little in the way of extra supplies compared to European ships. Crews relied on fishing gear, coconuts, breadfruit, taro, and water gourds, supplemented by what they caught en route. The navigator's role was not only to steer but to guide the crew's timing, choosing routes that matched wind, current, and food availability. You practice these habits, scanning the sky for the thin cirrus veil that hints at tomorrow's winds, sniffing the air for the tang of algae that signals fishing grounds, listening to the canoe timbers creak differently when humidity rises. Every small observation becomes a bead on a necklace, strung together until it forms a picture of what's coming. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some navigators were said to taste seawater at intervals, claiming they could detect slight changes in salinity that signaled proximity to islands or certain currents. Skeptics laugh, but modern oceanography admits salinity does shift with rainfall, river outflow, or reef ecosystems. Whether or not tongues can truly measure it, the story shows how finely tuned bodies once became to the ocean's textures. Historians still argue whether these embodied practices were consciously taught or whether they emerged from constant immersion. Was there a curriculum where elders said, "Taste the water, smell the wind," or did apprentices simply absorb those habits after thousands of hours aboard? The debate lingers, but the effect is the same. The ocean shapes you until your senses are stretched into instruments. You imagine yourself after months at sea, reflexes sharpened beyond recognition. You no longer jerk awake at every gust. Instead, your body automatically adjusts, hips leaning to balance before your mind even notices. You wake not by alarm, but by the feel of the swell shifting underneath. Hunger is eased by the quick flick of a net, thirst by knowing which coconuts are sweetest. Navigation is no longer separated from life. It is life, a continuous dance with the sea. The canoe becomes a floating classroom. Every crew member learns to lash, to fish, to chant, to listen. Knowledge is shared not in tidy lessons, but in lived repetitions. You catch yourself repeating phrases you didn't even know you remembered, humming star chants under your breath, feet tapping unconsciously to the rhythm of swells. It is as though the canoe itself is the teacher, Mao's lessons now woven into its frame. And you realize something soothing. The ocean no longer feels like an adversary. It feels like a demanding relative, one who nags, tests, and surprises, but ultimately feeds and guides you if you show respect. By living daily with the sea, you learn that navigation is not about conquering distance, but about maintaining relationship. As night folds over you, the stars emerge again, and your cheek against the hull picks up the steady, familiar pulse. After storms, after doubts, after centuries of forgetting and revival, the rhythm is still there, waiting for anyone patient enough to feel it. The horizon stretches thin and brilliant in the midday sun, and you notice something subtle. The reflection of the sky on the waves forms faint grids, almost like invisible roads. Your body has learned to interpret them. Even when the swell is irregular or the wind flickers unpredictably, these faint cues, light, shadow, color, are enough to guide a skilled eye. It feels magical, though it is simply trained perception. Mainstream historical fact: Polynesian navigators developed sophisticated systems of wave piloting, observing patterns in wind-driven surface waves, reflected swells from distant islands, and interactions between multiple swell systems. By integrating these observations with star positions and bird behavior, navigators could maintain accurate courses across thousands of miles. Historians still argue how universally these techniques were applied. Some argue only master navigators could interpret reflected swells consistently, while others suggest broader communal knowledge. You run your fingers along the hull and imagine the lines of energy moving beneath, intersecting and folding. There is a tactile language here, one that speaks to centuries of observation. One swell rises and dips, and you know it originated from a storm hundreds of miles east. Another ripple, subtler, hints at a reef far ahead. It's like reading Braille written in motion. Quirky tidbit: some navigators reportedly used cloud formations as mirrors to locate islands. Low, flat clouds often cluster over land due to moisture rising from warm soil and reefs. By measuring the distance between the cloud's edge and the horizon, a practiced navigator could triangulate direction. It's an improvisational tool, blending physics, intuition, and observation. Historians still argue whether these cloud methods were formalized or emerged organically through trial and error. Regardless, their inclusion demonstrates the flexibility of Polynesian navigation. Tools were not limited to stars, swells, or birds. They included every perceptible element of the environment. You notice the flight of frigate birds overhead. Their movement is no accident. They hunt, roost, and rest according to currents and proximity to land. A single flock can confirm a swell's suggestion or contradict it, forcing your mind to reconcile multiple signals simultaneously. The navigator does not choose convenience but accuracy. Every observation is double-checked, cross-referenced, tested against prior knowledge. The canoe feels alive beneath you. Every plank, lash, and curve of the hull contributes to your reading of the ocean. Even small imperfections, slight warps, minor gaps, add texture to the sensory input, providing data points the navigator interprets subconsciously. You realize that skill is not simply memorization or technique, but deep attunement. Your body becomes a living instrument, translating the ocean's language into actionable understanding. At midday, when the sun climbs overhead and heat radiates off the water, you are reminded that long-distance navigation is a continuous negotiation between human perception and environmental variability. The navigator must remain alert to sudden shifts in wind, changes in cloud patterns, and the invisible push of currents. Flexibility, patience, and constant observation are not optional, they are survival. As the day stretches on, you take a deep breath and close your eyes. The ocean's language is still there, persistent and patient, and your body, your mind, your attention, is slowly learning to speak it back. The skill feels eternal, yet it is fragile, carried in each movement, each sigh of the hull, each pulse of the swell beneath you. You are part of something that stretches across time and space, a living chain linking past masters to the present moment. The sun has dipped lower now, and the light softens into amber that glows on the swell crests like liquid gold. You notice the subtle shifts in water temperature, the faint hum of currents meeting beneath the hull, and the changing direction of scattered birds. These are signals the canoe translates before you even have a chance to think. Your body and the sea have become collaborators, moving in tandem without words. Mainstream historical fact: Polynesian navigators often relied on island signs that included oceanic, avian, and atmospheric cues, creating a multi-layered mental map to determine position when out of sight of land. This method allowed voyages spanning thousands of miles with remarkable precision, long before European instruments arrived. Historians still argue whether the method required lifelong apprenticeship exclusively, or if it could be learned quickly by exceptionally observant individuals. You notice how the wind smells differently when you approach shallow reefs. It's not just scent, it's a combination of humidity, particulate matter from broken coral, and the subtle echoing of the swell. You realize that every sense is active. Touch, taste, sight, smell, even hearing in the quiet hum of the hull as it responds to the water. Each signal layers on top of the others, creating a three-dimensional mental map of invisible forces. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some navigators reportedly slept with one hand on the hull during long night watches, claiming that the vibrations traveling through the wood could warn them of subtle shifts in the swell, indicating a nearby shoal or reef. It sounds extreme, but the effect, heightened tactile perception, would have been invaluable when visibility was low. Historians still argue whether these techniques were universally practiced or whether they were unique to specific master navigators. Some oral histories describe dramatic stories of foresight, sailors detecting islands hundreds of miles away or spotting subtle swell patterns that others ignored. Skeptics call it exaggeration, but consistent accounts from multiple islands suggest there is truth embedded in legend. You begin to sense the rhythm of day turning to night. The ocean is teaching patience once again, a slow and measured lesson that mirrors life itself. The sun touches the horizon and casts long shadows across your palms as you trace the lines of the canoe. Every memory you have of swell, wind, bird, and star merges into a single awareness. You are an extension of the sea, an instrument finely tuned through experience, apprenticeship, and patience. The gentle night chill seeps through your shirt, carrying with it the scent of distant land and open water. You feel the interconnectedness of all things, the ancestors who first left islands, the revivalists like Mao, the birds overhead, and the swell patterns tracing invisible highways across the Pacific. You realize the ocean is not only a teacher of navigation, but a vessel of continuity, carrying knowledge across generations. And as the twilight deepens, you understand that every lesson, the storms, the long pause, the revival, the meticulous reading of waves, is part of a continuum. The canoe rocks softly under you, the stars begin to glimmer, and the ocean hums an unbroken chant of memory, patience, and human ingenuity. You lie back, feeling each swell as both history and present reality, your body a living link in the chain of navigators who have crossed this endless expanse. Night falls fully now, and the stars scatter across the sky like spilled silver coins. The ocean beneath you is calm but alive, vibrating with the memory of every voyage that has come before. You feel the cumulative weight of all that knowledge, the chants, the swell readings, the bird behaviors, the lessons from Mao, the centuries of practice, the pauses, the revivals, coalescing into something you can almost hold in your chest. It is a quiet authority, a rhythm of trust that reminds you the Pacific is vast, but not unknowable. Mainstream historical fact. The Polynesian voyaging tradition spans thousands of years, with navigators successfully crossing distances exceeding 4,000 kilometers using stars, swells, birds, cloud patterns, and other environmental cues. This record, corroborated by archaeology, oral history, and modern revival voyages, demonstrates one of humanity's most extraordinary achievements in spatial cognition and seafaring skill. Historians still argue about exact techniques for certain islands or eras, but the overall scope of achievement remains undeniable. You notice how the canoe responds instinctively to your adjustments, how the hull seems to absorb your body's intent and transmit it to the water. Each movement is mirrored by the ocean in a delicate conversation that requires attention, patience, and humility. This dialogue between human and sea, continuous and unbroken, has allowed Polynesian voyaging to survive, disappear, and then return with renewed vigor. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some navigators traditionally carried tiny bundles of coconut husk soaked in seawater on deck to hear subtle shifts in the wind and swell. The fibers would rustle or stick in ways that, when interpreted correctly, could confirm or contradict the navigator's visual and tactile assessments. To outsiders, this might seem like superstition, but to trained eyes and hands, it was a supplemental instrument, reinforcing the body's innate perception. Historians still argue about the role of such marginal instruments in historical navigation. Were they widespread, or unique to certain islands or teachers? Were they practical aids, ritual objects, or both? Regardless of interpretation, the stories underscore the creativity and ingenuity embedded in the tradition, a constant adaptation of knowledge to human perception and environmental conditions. You lean back against the smooth plank, listening to the soft, steady pulse of the hull. The ocean is speaking, not only in swells and winds, but in echoes of those who have sailed these waters before. Every long voyage, every apprentice's ordeal, every revivalist effort is layered in the swell, invisible yet undeniable. You feel connected not only to your present moment, but to a continuum stretching across centuries and islands. The canoe drifts forward into deeper darkness, yet you feel no fear. You understand that Polynesian navigation is more than a technical skill. It is a philosophy, a lived practice, a relationship between humans and the vastness of the Pacific. Each wave, star, and bird is a participant in a dialogue that transcends generations, requiring trust, patience, humility, and attentiveness. The wind carries a soft whisper, the distant cry of a seabird, and the faint reflection of starlight on the swell. You close your eyes and let your body remember all it has absorbed. The star paths, the swell patterns, the stories, the rhythms. The ocean, steady and enduring, holds its secrets but also its trust. You realize that you are part of this living legacy, a thread woven into the endless fabric of exploration, memory, and reverence. And in this final, hushed moment, you let the canoe, the ocean, and the stars lull you into the knowledge that human ingenuity, attentiveness, and courage have created pathways across the vast Pacific, pathways that continue to ripple forward into the future. You are not alone. You are carried, sustained, and awakened by a legacy older than most nations. The swell eases, the night stretches wide, and you feel the last traces of tension in your shoulders release like water through a sieve. The stars above dim softly behind a haze, and the world around you seems to stretch into a gentle, infinite rhythm. The canoe rocks lightly, as if sighing, the ocean humming an unbroken lullaby, and you sink into its slow cadence. Here, there is no hurry, no deadlines, no need to prove your knowledge. There is only presence, your body against the hull, your hands resting, your attention following the pulse of the water. Breathe. Each inhalation fills your lungs with the salty perfume of the sea. Each exhalation drifts outward into the night. Remember the ancestors who first left islands in tiny canoes, guided by stars and swells, who trusted their instincts, their knowledge, and each other. Remember the periods of forgetting and the revival that brought these arts back, the tireless patience of teachers like Pielug, and the generations of students who listened, repeated, and passed it forward. All of it flows beneath you now, a current you can feel and be part of. Let the minor anxieties, the world's constant hum, the endless lists of tasks drift away. You are cradled by time itself, the swell beneath you a metronome of history, culture, and human daring. The ocean holds you in its rhythm, and the stars, even if blurred behind night's veil, are points of continuity, reminders of scale and patience. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let your mind float with the canoe, the swell, and the generations of navigators who have taught the seas to speak. Allow the pulse to slow your heartbeat, soften your thoughts, and ease every muscle. This is a voyage without distance, a journey inward, a gentle passage into the calm spaces between conscious thought and the deep knowing that comes from listening. Sleep arrives like the tide, steady, inevitable, and carrying with it the assurance that knowledge, courage, and care are never lost. They merely wait to be remembered again.